one thing I've learned in life is difficult, but the problem is life is difficult. I think for everybody, and some of us see it as harder than others, and that's okay. It's based on our own perceptions. It's based on our own understanding, but we create. Most of us, there are a few of us, I think, that are in situations based on uh, genetics that are stuck with this disease that makes their life a little bit harder or harder, excuse me, for minimizing their difficulties. But I suffer from depression, and it's difficult. I see it as a series of choices or a series of non-choices, but non-choices are still choices. They're still choices to move in a certain direction or not move in a certain direction based on how you feel about the situation and what's going on at that point in time. So we all kind of make our own lives difficult in ways that we're comfortable with so that we can be uncomfortable with our uncomfortableness. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but to be honest, I think it does. Because we create our own world. We are what we eat. We are what we eat. That doesn't necessarily mean, if you eat a lot of bacon, you're a pig. It's what it means is what you surround yourself with, what you envelop yourself with, what you invest your time in. That's who you become. Um, it doesn't happen instantaneously, and most of us don't even know it's happening because it's a gradual process that happens over the course of 40, 50 years. Um, we are today what we were as a base of a creation of who we were in the past. Um, and if we want to change who we are, we first have to invest a little bit of time and thought in what is it that we're doing, where is it that we want to go, and how is it that you're going to get from where you are to where you want to be. I mean, if you want to, be a bodybuilder, well, sitting around watching TV all the time ain't going to get you there. It just is not going to happen. You want to be a movie star, you got to be willing to invest more time than anybody else. I mean, because you got to think about the fact that the people that are movie stars, most of them aren't blessed with some magical talent. Some of them are, but for most of them, it's a matter of time and energy that they've invested into their craft, and that's the 1%. Are you willing to be the person that puts in the 99% of the energy? Because if you are, then you're gonna get to where you want not only faster, more productive, you're probably going to be better at what it is that you want to do. So if what you want to do is lift weights, then lift weights. But lift weights with the idea that you're going to have to push it to get to where you want to go. Make a decision, push your boundaries. Start slow. Don't kill yourself. We all, I don't know, but I do this thing where, oh, I'm going to go exercise, and I go out and I exercise for 5 hours. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm a pretty big guy, and exercising for 5 hours is great, and I can do it. It's a lot of work, but the next day I'm so exhausted that I don't want to do it again because that was a lot of work. So you got to start somewhere that you're comfortable with. Also, having somebody else to do it with is a very important thing. That second day, if I had done the first day with somebody else and we had both agreed that we're going to come in the second day, well, we're probably that much more likely to come in that second day. Also, if this person on the second day, the person that you're working out with, is somebody that you respect or want the respect of, it becomes that much more involved. You become that much more vested in what's going on because we're often willing to do more for somebody else than we are willing to do for ourselves. That's a pretty strange one that I don't quite understand. You would think you would be more willing to do something for yourself than other people, but I don't think that's true. There's several times in my life I've owned my own businesses, and I find that it's hard to convince myself to get up every day and do the things that I need to do. But when I'm working for somebody else, and if I don't get up and do the things for somebody else, I lose my job. Well, then I get up and I do the things that I need to do. There's that first of all, you're letting other people down, and second of all, you've got the risk of, if you don't do the things you're supposed to do today, then tomorrow you might not have the job that you need to have to pay the bills that you need to do the things that you need to do. So find a vested partner. Find someone that likes you. Find someone that's going to push you a little bit, that's going to encourage you, that kind of maybe knows what they're doing around what's going on. That's a mentor. That's what that is. That's somebody that's going to push you. And the biggest, best, and brightest amongst us do that. I mean, therapists have therapists. That's why, because they can disseminate the information that's going on in their own head, but they can help you better because they're helping themselves more. Bodybuilders do the same thing. Bodybuilders have workout buddies. Maybe they're not mentors. Maybe they're not trainers. Maybe they're just people that have been through or are going through it with you and are willing to give you bits of encouragement that poke you and prod you in the right direction. It doesn't need to be somebody you pay. It can be somebody you pay. I think our society is moving in the direction of service. The service industry is going to be all that's left probably in the United States come 40 years from now. One of the things that we've offloaded a lot is manufacturing and factory work and stuff like that. Well, once you get rid of all of those, the service industry really is all that's left. Service industry is the movie industry, is a service industry. They're in creating laughter and encouragement and happiness and a place to go to alleviate the stresses that are created by the momentary issues that happen in your life. The food industry is a service industry. The massage industry, the therapy industry, who knows? It's building houses. You're servicing somebody else. You're helping them fix their house. You're helping them build their thing. Granted, maybe you don't consider construction a service industry, but you're servicing somebody. You got to get some kind of need. You're filling somebody's need, and that's a service. Though I guess you could say the same thing for factory work. I'm building a car. Well, I'm servicing somebody's needs. Well, yeah, I guess that's true. But we are getting rid of a lot of our service industry jobs, our non-service industry jobs, and that's because the country that we've created, not we, generations prior, money, situational awareness, it all adds into what this creation is. And this creation is, 140 years ago, they were spraying chemicals on crops. They started inventing chemicals and they started spraying them on crops, and people started having three-headed babies. And so they threw a fit and they created unions, and they start making rules that made it so businesses couldn't hurt us as much. And so what our businesses did is they said, well, I can't make as much money here, but I can go to a different country and I can extrapolate this same labor from a different series of people that haven't created the unions yet, that haven't stood up for themselves, that don't believe they have the power to stand up, and then so they get the three-headed babies or whatever. I'm exaggerating about the baby thing, but it is something we do. One of the things I read the other day absolutely baffles me. It said the straw that you drank out of in 1978. Now, I'm speaking of you in the terms of you, not you necessarily. I wasn't born in 1978. But let's say the straw that you drank out of in 1978 is now particles that are in the air. There's plastics in the air. When you breathe in the air, you get these particles in it. And so we have populated our world with plastics. And thankfully, these days, scientists are coming out with ways to create bacteria that can eat plastics. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. But now we have over 5 trillion pieces of plastic in the ocean. Now, a trillion's a lot. A trillion is a lot. I think if you stacked $1 billion $1 bills, it would be more than from here to the moon. So a trillion is a lot. It's 1,000 times more than a billion. So 1,000 times from here to the moon. That's just it's a number that I can't even imagine. And so we're finding that animals are dying in the ocean. Their sharks are washing up on shore with 32 plastic bags in their belly, and they die because essentially they can't get food through the plastic bags in their digestive system so that they can process those foods. Whales getting found washed ashore with 65 pounds of plastic in their mouth because they've never had to evolutionary wise design a reason for them to open up their mouth and let go of what's in it. What they do is they pull in a bunch of water and then they push out the water and close their mouth, and the krill, these are giant whales, but they feed off the tiniest of animals, and so they blow out all the excess water, and what they're left with is the krill. In this case, this whale also had 65 pounds of plastic in its mouth that it couldn't swallow. So that's not including the plastic that's already in its friggin' belly. It's just 65 pounds of plastic in its mouth. I don't know. I consider that to be an abuse of our world. How many pictures of turtles have you seen with beer can not cozy, but the beer can plastic ringy thingy got stuck around the turtle, and then the turtle grows, but where that plastic thingy is, it can't grow because it's getting this torque pulled on it by the plastic ringy thingy, and so essentially it's going to die at some point because it can't survive anymore in the conditions that it exists in. And you say, some people say, well, it's no big thing. Well, sure, it's no big thing to the one or two turtles that it happens to. Maybe, if you think about it that way. I don't know. I tend to think about it as it's pretty abusive neglect of our position in this world. The Bible talks about we're supposed to be basically we're supposed to take care of the world that we live in. We are in charge, and being in charge includes paying attention to not only what you do but the repercussions behind what you do, because there are repercussions behind what you do, and we don't always think about how that what we do affects the world. Fracking is a thing. We're pulling oil out of the ground. Fracking, no big deal. People don't care. We're getting oil. We need oil. We need oil to exist because we're this society that uses a lot of oil. Well, that's great. But what they do with fracking, and I don't understand why this is acceptable, but they use a certain mixture of chemicals and water and pressurize it into the ground. And what that does is that pulls the rocks that are, the shale rocks or whatever the rock formations are that are underground. It presses them apart a little bit, and the little pockets of oil that were in there get extruded out and pushed into a new venture that then gets pulled out by the oil companies. And though that sounds okay, that's kind of acceptable. The problem is the mixture of chemicals and water doesn't have to be released to the public. So it's proprietary information, and it helps them. So essentially they can dump toxic waste into the ground. I'm sure there's some rules around it, but they don't have to let the government know, as long as they're dumping things into the ground that are not on this certain list, I'm sure, that they can dump them into the ground. And so we're ended up with not only people that can light their water supply on fire. They can literally turn on the faucet, light a light, and they get flame. But Pennsylvania is now the earthquake capital of the United States, and apparently they have something like 437 earthquakes a year. They never used to have that many earthquakes, but when you got so much water getting pushed into the ground, there's pressing all the rocks apart. You're reducing the friction because the rocks aren't laying on each other anymore. They're actually got a gap in them, and so the rocks are sliding on the other rocks. Maybe that's not such a big deal. They're little earthquakes. They're not, the giant things that you watch movies and the disaster movies that happen. but they are earthquakes, and they are causing perturbations in the world around us. Um, People say, well, we should go to electric energy. Well, that's great, but electric energy is still energy. It still has to be created somehow, and if we don't push green energy. Now, green energy isn't as green as you might want it to be, but it's still greener than oil or coal, which is good in my mind. Nuclear power is a good thing and a bad thing. There are one of the things about nuclear power I don't understand is back in 1978 there was a president. I don't know who he was. I think it was in 1978. Basically, anyways, the guy, nuclear war was going on, the Cold War, and so we didn't want to build any radioactive chemicals that, not chemicals, but like plutonium. Plutonium is what makes nuclear bombs possible, and so through nuclear power, they take these giant rods and they somehow deplete the electrons that are in those nuclear rods. And then what they do is they take the rods, they're highly radioactive rods, and they stick them in caskets. So these giant cement caskets that, cement typically is known to last 100, 200, 300 years, maybe a little bit more. But it's not going to last the 20,000 years it's going to take for the nuclear rods that are inside them to lose their radioactivity. I'm sure they do some structural integrity that's more than just concrete, but even if they made them out of steel, it still wouldn't last as long as the radioactive rods would. So one of the things you can do with a radioactive rod is you can bring it to what's called a breeder reactor. Now, a breeder reactor will actually take the rod, re-inject electrons into the rod, and in doing that create electricity. So they re-energize the rods that are going to then be shipped back to the nuclear power plant, but they also create energy in doing that. The problem is plutonium is a byproduct of this breeder reactor, and and so I think it was Gerald Ford. That's what I sticking in my brain. Anyways, so they basically said that we're not allowed to have breeder reactors because breeder reactors are dangerous because the byproduct of breeder reactor is plutonium. The thing that I don't understand, though, is plutonium is explosive. And don't we use explosives every single day in our cars to get to work? I mean, we call it gasoline or diesel or whatever you want to call it, but it's still an explosive. There's still this little bit that's injected into this cylinder that's then pressurized, that then they ignite some sort of electrical charge, which causes the pressure to expand because we now have gas and flame and fire, which pushes the cylinder down. Can't we do the same thing with plutonium? Can't we make this cylinder piston engine sort of friggin' thing, put it somewhere underground near the breeder reactor, that we're taking the byproduct plutonium and we're then using it to create more energy? Man, doesn't that kind of make sense? Why couldn't we do something like that? Well, we can't do it because Gerald Ford in the Cold War decided that we couldn't have more plutonium. Now, we already have a fair amount of plutonium because we have, over 1,000 nuclear weapons, and we continue to make more nuclear weapons, even though we're technically not supposed to be making. I'm sure there's rules around how many we're allowed to be making. If anybody has done any research, I found out there's a video online that shows how many nuclear explosions there have been. Now, personally, I figured 5. Right? We've got the one in Arizona where they originally tested the nuclear bombs, proved that it worked. They got 2 more that happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which are nuclear explosions. One of the nice things that I learned about that more recently is the radiation from that only lasted, days until it brought it down to a reasonable level where people could live there. So it's not as long lasting as, say, 3 Mile Island or not Hiroshima. The one in Russia, the Anyways, the nuclear power plant that exploded in Russia, people still can't live there. That created enough radiation for the local environment that animals live there now. But there have been some. While your body is growing, your body absorbs radiation, and I think it gets stuck in your thyroid. I'm not sure why that matters, that it gets stuck in your thyroid, but because the radiation gets absorbed in your system, it then magnifies itself. And the thing and so the radiation from this nuclear power plant in Russia, basically, it was so intense, and it still is, and it will be for another 10,000 years, that people aren't going to be able to live there and grow. The people can go there to die, and it won't increase your likelihood of dying, because once you've reached a certain age, your body isn't creating newer parts. You're not growing. Your brain isn't growing. You're just kind of existing. And so you may die of liver cancer or something like that, because your liver still regenerates. All of our body organs still regenerate, but they do it very slowly. And so once you've done your growth process and your brain's not growing and your body's not growing anymore, you're not going to have as much impact from this. One interesting thing that nobody thinks about is everything that we do that uses electricity creates radiation. So depending on how close you are to your microwave, anybody ever noticed that your microwave, it used to have like a fence, if you will. It had wires that went this way and wires that went that way, and there was wire, and wire. Now most of them have holes in it. Actually, apparently I learned in physics class, if you put a line this way, it knocks down the radiation. Lines this way, it knocks down the radiation by, it's like 20%. And if you put them horizontally, it does 20%. If you do them vertically, it does 20%. If you do horizontally and vertically, it's only like 30%. But if you make them diagonal, right, it knocks it up to like 73% reduction in radiation that gets through that barrier. I'm sure a hole is even less. Due to its geometry, I'm sure it's got something to do with the frequency of the vibration of the electrons that are happening inside the microwave chamber. So when you turn your toaster on, there's radiation that comes out of that. When you have your cell phone, I mean, how many people carry their cell phone in their pocket, right? That has radiation that comes off from it. And so the cells around the cell phone, your body cells that are around your cell phone, actually have some interaction with the vibration of the molecules that are happening around it based on the power that's happening through the cell phone. And so we could be creating our own version of cancer, brain cancer, ear cancer, as we're talking on our cell phones. So thankfully, it's kind of thankful actually, a lot of people don't talk on their cell phones anymore, right? They hold it up, they use it, they text messages or whatever, or they talk to the phone, and then it either does a text message or they're a video, some sort of video chat or whatever. And so that's distancing ourselves from the radiation that's being created. Now, again, don't get out of control. The radiation is what our government considers a healthy level of radiation. But for anybody that lives near high tension power lines, that birds don't land on high tension power lines. The reason they don't is because there's enough radiation going on around them that if you listen carefully, they actually vibrate. And so there's a noise that comes off them. There's an energy level that comes off them that makes it so that animals don't want to get near those things. The birds will get on regular power lines much more often. So we're doing this thing to ourselves where we're creating a world that it's livable, but it's 5 trillion pieces of plastic in our oceans. There's cities, I understand, in parts of China. The United States has shipped China all of our trash for a long time. At least California has. Probably the East Coast have, as the West Coast have. By the way, that's like 93% of the population of the country is all along the coastlines. No, I'm not including, Texas, where it's on the border of Mexico. There is people that live there too, and there's a lot of people that live there. But an interesting thing that happens actually is most civilizations, somewhere around 90% of the people live within 100 miles of international borders. And so that's the coastline on the East Coast, the West Coast, California, and somewhat across Canada. Canada has done it differently because the money that came into Canada came from the United States. And so 90% of the people that live in Canada live within 100 miles of the United States border, whatever the 53 degree meridian or whatever it is. So, and a lot of countries are like that. I think that's kind of a normal thing because that's how people could get into the country. That's how people get out of the country. That's how people get money. And so that's where things happen that build up our world. For anybody who wants to know, the largest known source of gold on this planet is in the ocean, obviously. But it's actually not just in the ocean. It's in Boston Harbor. Boston Harbor, which is completely made of mud, has existed as part of the United States for, longer than the country has been around. Right? The country's been around since 1776. That's officially around. But they sailed over here in 1476 or something like that. In the mid 1400s. So that's another 300 years that port was being used, though that area was being used for some sort of inlet of traffic and outlet of traffic. And so there have enough boats have been damaged there that they've sunk to the bottom. The gold has, the wood has disintegrated at some point. The gold has dug a hole, because gold apparently is 28 times heavier than water. And so when a gold gets in water, it sinks to the bottom very quickly. And so even if gold is on top of wood that's in the ocean, there's still waves that happen in the ocean that get inside this boat that cause some sort of disturbance, which get underneath the gold, which cause some sort of erosion, and then the gold just continues to sink until wherever it hits bedrock. Right? Because once it hits bedrock, it can't really go any further. So if there was a way to get into Boston Harbor and dig down and find out where the bedrock was, you could find a lot of gold. You could find a lot of gold. Some of it's probably drifted out towards the ocean a little bit more, or into the ocean a little bit more, but a lot of it's in the harbor. Because once it gets down that far, it probably doesn't have a lot of fluctuation based on the current, unless the bedrock itself is shaped in a way so that the gold fell down here, and then there's a shelf, right? Because that's what happens in the ocean. The ocean actually, the sand goes out and out and out and out and out, and at some point it drops, and that's called the shelf, and that actually will cause anybody that's gone to the ocean understands, or should understand, undertow. Undertow is created by that. See, the wave comes in right on top of the water, and it cruises in, it cruises in, it cruises in. At some point, it crests and it lands on the beach, and it goes back out on the bottom, and so that going back out on the bottom, going back out, and all of a sudden, boom, it drops off, and then that drop off could be thousands of feet, and so the water that gets sucked in there causes this vacuum that pulls whatever might be standing there. And so there are parts of the ocean where if you walk out there, you literally could get pulled out because the backflush of a wave could rip your feet out from under you and suck you right out in the ocean. It happens. And they put up signs for things like that, but because they know where they are. They've done studies. They've seen people have that problem. They've looked at it from lots of different perspectives, so they understand where it's going to happen and why it's going to happen. But made me a little afraid of water. First time I went into the ocean, I'm a Vermont kid, and I'm used to swimming in the lake and swimming in rivers and swimming in ponds and maybe pools. Not a lot of pools when I was a kid, but there's more these days. But there was no no undertow that happened in most of my swimming until I went out to the ocean, and I was a pretty good swimmer. I was, and I got out there and I started swimming, and I can't get back, right? Because if you think about it, if you're small enough and you can't swim stronger than the current, and you could put your feet down, but if the undertow is great enough, even if you're pretty small, I was 10 years old or whatever, the undertow rips my feet out from under me and I can't swim anymore. I can't walk in, and I'm running out of energy to swim. Like it's pretty scary. Interesting thing about the world that we live in, we talk about, people talk about, anyways, it's like 78% covered in water, which is 99.3% the ocean, right? There's a little bit of fresh water in there, lakes, Great Lakes, whatever, rivers, but surface wise, the ocean covers way more area. So people think of the earth as like we'll never run out of water, right? But the scary thing is we are it's not that much water when you think about it in terms of a relationship to the size of the earth. Now, if we take the earth and we shrink it down to the size of a basketball, the earth is 24,000 miles around, roughly. Let's just say 24,000 miles. And that means that it's what, pi 2 pi r around the outside. And so 2 pi is 6, 24,000, 6.3, let's call it. 24,000 miles divided by 6.3. Even if we call it 7, it's still what, 3.2? So 3.2 thousand miles around the outside, or the radius is 3.2 thousand miles. And so if we shrink that down to the size of a basketball's a foot in diameter roughly, right? So then we've got, if we divide what's 27,000 miles, we divide it into 1, we make it 1 foot, then on the surface of the basketball, there's going to be a little bit of water, right? It's not going to be a lot of water. It's going to be a little bit of water. The ocean is, 5 miles deep. The deepest part of the ocean is like 10 miles deep, and that's the Mariana Trench. But that's one spot and that's one trench. There's probably a couple more. Well, I mean, I don't know. But that's one spot. That's a couple of spots. And so typically the ocean probably isn't much more than 2-3 miles thick. So if we think about it, if we average it out 2-3 miles, well, that's still 3 miles is 1/1000th of 3,000, right? And so if we shrink it down to 1 foot, then we're talking about 1/1000th of a foot. And then what's 1/1000th of a foot? I don't know. It's not a lot though, right? Like a 1/12 of a foot is an inch. And so we have what? We divide 1,000 by 12, we get 800 and something. So 1/800th of an inch, right? No, 80. 1/80th of an inch. Still, 1/80th of an inch is not a lot. So apparently, if you take the Earth and you shrink it down to the size of a basketball, and you want to know how much water is on the Earth, if you take that basketball and you dip it in water and you pull it out, and then you bounce it on the ground one time and catch it, that's how much water is left on the Earth. It's really not a lot. So we definitely have the possibility of damaging that ecosystem, and the ocean is the basis of life. I don't know how many people believe that, but if we kill everything that's in the ocean by putting too much plastic or oil, right? How many times have we had oil spills that have happened, or the Exxon Valdez was an oil spill, but off the coast of Louisiana, they had oil spewing out for months out of the ocean, which was like 1,000 times worse than the Exxon Valdez. And they say, so they've done some studies. They do them. They have a deep water study thing for scientists so that they can find out what happened to the excess oil, because they don't think they found like less than half the oil they found. And studies basically show that there's giant pools of oil that are sitting between 3 to 5,000 feet below the ocean level. Which you think, oh, who gives a shit, right? Like, nothing that I do matters to that. But if you think about a fish, and fish, not a lot of fish swim there. Whales swim there, sharks swim there. Some fish do. But most of the time, it's the bigger animals that live out in the big ocean. And the little animals kind of live near things. So, like, your coral reef or your lava tubes, like they have jets of lava that come out all over the place that kind of cause islands to happen. Your coral reefs where a lot of animals live because there's safety there. They don't necessarily want to go out into the broad ocean because there's not a lot of safety there. But some of them live on the bottom, right? They're crustaceans or whatever. So the crustaceans we don't have to worry about that much, but there's animals that swim throughout the ocean. If they're swimming along and they happen to swim through that barrier, well, now they're covered in oil, right? And I don't understand the dynamics of what happens to an animal that's swimming at 5,000 feet below the ocean level that now swims through a pool of oil. Can it still breathe? Can it still see? Like, what are the... Because it doesn't close its eyes. It doesn't understand, hey, look, there's a patch of oil here. Maybe I should close my eyes before I go swimming through it. Because it doesn't know. It doesn't understand what that is. And so, do its eyes work now? Can it see anymore? Like, there are now... I don't know if they've always been there. I'm sure maybe they have. But there's now these jellyfish blooms that happen. Apparently, think about a patch of jellyfish, 20 miles long, 20 miles wide, 20 miles in diameter, this giant patch of jellyfish, and they've stuck cameras down 70 feet, and to stick down 70 feet of jellyfish as it is on the surface of the ocean. And you think, well, who gives a shit? It's jellyfish. They swim around, it doesn't matter. But jellyfish are what we would call single-celled organisms. They're not really single-celled organisms, but they are kind of the basis of the food chain, of the organization of cellular structure that happened in the ocean, however long ago that it started. And so animals that are on the basis of the food chain consume everything. And so if like a fish swims in there, it's completely consumed. If oxygen gets in there, it's completely consumed. And if sunlight hits it, it's completely consumed. Because these animals need to convert into energy anything that they can so that they can survive. And they don't think anything of it because they're jellyfish. They're single-celled organisms that, like, gotta get food, man. Right? Like, that's what the tentacles are all about. It's gotta get food, man. And as soon as something hits those tentacles, it then becomes paralyzed and it finds it and pulls it up and consumes it. I mean, that's what jellyfish do. So there's roving bands of jellyfish that are 20, 30 miles in diameter. I don't think they can consume plastic yet, but who knows, man? Like, it's thoroughly possible. I would hope that jellyfish could, but I don't think they're going to be able to. So we've done a lot to damage the planet that we live on. People talk about global warming. I think it's more along the lines of climate's changing. And climates change. And so maybe it's not as big a deal as we might think it is. But here's some information to think about. Every bit of roadway that we make on this planet is another patch of land that there isn't trees and there isn't grass and there isn't whatever was there in the first place. Most of it wasn't rock and most of it wasn't desert. Because if it was desert, chances are we're not going to be living there for the most part. Other than, there are some places where, like, we live in Nevada, Arizona, whatever. There's desert there, but I'm sure that's not the predominant place where we live on land, right? Like, we live on the coast. The coasts have had islands and land and trees and nature growing all over it. They say early on, Vermont, which is a tiny little state up by New York, they came in and they clear cut basically every single tree that they could possibly cut so that they could build New York City, right? And they did that sort of thing. And there's a waterway, Lake Champlain, and so they bring all the logs to the water, and then they float them down a river, however that happens. Which, is not a big thing, because now the trees grow back, and it is what it is. And at the point in time when mankind was cutting these trees down by hand, right, because that's what they were doing. In fact, I've seen a tree up in the woods in Vermont where it's like somebody cut into the tree all the way around it. But it's such a big tree that whatever the utensil that they were using to cut into it, it wasn't thick enough to get to the middle of the tree. And so the tree's still hanging there. Like, it's not alive anymore because you killed it, but it still sits there because they couldn't figure out how to cut it down. Now, out in the West, they figured that out, right? Because they had those big redwood trees or whatever that are a much different story. And so they had to figure out ways to cut those down. But up in this neck of the woods, they didn't have trees like that, and so they didn't have to come up with other ways to cut the trees down. But these days, it's a different story, right? Like, I don't know if you've seen those tree cutting machines, but basically they grab a hold of the tree, and they have this thing that goes zink, and it cuts off the tree underneath, and they pick up the tree and they turn it sideways, and then they like hit a button and it pulls the tree. This is still the holder thing, right? This is the tree, and it pulls the tree through, and it basically cuts all the limbs off the tree. And then it zooms it back to the beginning, and it pulls it back to a certain point until it gets a certain length, and it chops it off and it throws it in a pile. And it does that again. Chop, chop, until the fucking tree's gone. And then it reaches over and it grabs another tree and it picks it up and zing! Zoom, zoom, chop, zoom, zoom, chop, zoom, zoom, chop. And so now we have machines that can cut down a tree in 37 seconds and then reach over and grab another tree. In 37 seconds, it took one man a day to do that with a handsaw, right? Maybe he could cut down a couple of trees, but you still couldn't drag them into piles, like get them organized, bring them to the ocean. Like, do we have machinery, man? There are bucket loaders out there. There are excavating equipment out there that's one bucket is bigger than a tractor trailer load of dirt. And I've seen this one. It's like a Ferris wheel, right? This giant fucking Ferris wheel where one scoop is as big as a tractor trailer truck bucket, and it just scoops the dirt up as the fucking thing rolls forward, and it turns the head of the giant fucking thing. And in the middle, there's this manufacturing facility where it dumps the dirt in, and it sorts the rocks out, and it pulls the whatever, and it puts the rocks in this dump truck, and it puts the sand in this dump truck, and it's got these big holding cavities that probably weigh out the dirt and the sand and the whatever, so that it can separate all the whatever, and the machine just walks. Right? They've got this giant plot of land. I don't know what they're doing with it, but they're like getting rid of a mountain or something like that. They want to flatten the land, and so they've got this big machine that scoops up dirt, and it's thousands and thousands of tractor trailer loads a day. It's just continuous scoop. And so we've got these giant machines that now do what, think about how many shovels full of dirt fill up a tractor trailer load. right? They measure it by yardage. A dump truck is, I think, 6 yards, and so a tractor trailer truck, let's say, is 12. I'm probably wrong on that. 12 yards, and a yard is literally a yard, which is 3.3 feet by a yard. So it's a cubic yard of dirt. How many shovels full is that? One, like, that's a lot of shovels full. And we've got these machines that just like scoop up that much earth in a matter of seconds. Um Global warming, so yeah, back to global warming anyway. So we're building cities, and the cities are made of stone, if you will. Right, like we've got glass buildings, and there's metal, and there's stone, right? Concrete, cement, whatever you want to call it, that we're building these houses with. Brick. um Even if you don't have brick or you concrete, let's say the house that I'm living in has a black tar roof, and it doesn't make much of a difference here in Vermont, but you can actually tell this state is one of those. I don't know, other states probably can too, but we've got a couple of main cities. Burlington is the one I live close to, and from Burlington to where I live typically is a 12-degree difference in the middle of the summer, right? So Burlington, even though it's sitting right next to the lake, which is causing it to give off a lot of more heat because the lake absorbs the heat of the city, um, where I live, a half an hour north, is in far enough into the country that we don't have the heat that's created by the roadways and by the buildings and by, because every building absorbs a little bit more heat. All that tar on the roof absorbs a little bit more heat. The roadways absorb a little more heat, and so do the cars, right? And so all of these things exude a little bit more heat. There's also the, I don't know if everybody knows this or not, but when you, an air conditioner, let's say, an air conditioner takes, and it causes this sort of disruption in the chamber. It uses pistons and whatever. It doesn't matter what it uses. But basically it causes cold on one side while it causes heat on the other side, right? And so, yeah, your house is nice and cool, but on the outside, you're pushing heat into the world. So every air conditioner in every car, every air conditioner in every building, every air conditioner, I work in a factory, every air conditioner in the factory, or we, not just air conditioners, right? Because factories need to cool down machineries. And so that's creating a little excess heat that we're dumping into the environment. Every factory, a nuclear power plant, if you will, is nothing but a steam generator, right? It sounds more complicated than that, but when you break it down to its basics, it's a steam generator. And so what it does is it uses the electrons that are created in the plutonium or the uranium or whatever it is that excite and bounce around and hit into one another, that cause more energy, which create more heat. And it takes that heat and it cycles the water. And so it's got actually multiple water cycles. So it's got the main one, which is actually, I think it uses heavy water. So it's, instead of H2O, it's H3O. Apparently it reacts differently, I don't know, to the radioactive process. And so it takes this H3O and it cycles it through a radiator, just like your car would cycle the heat out of the radiator using your antifreeze, right? And it cycles it to a second system, which cycles it to a third system, which then uses that heat in relation to some other cold, right? Because you can't, you have to be able to transfer heat from a hot place to a cold place, otherwise you have no energy transfer. And so the way that nuclear power plants work is they take heat that's created in the nuclear power plant, and let's say they're next to the ocean or the lake or a river, and it pulls in some of that cold. So it now has a heat difference between the hot that it created and the cold that exists on the other side, which causes the steam to go from the hot place to the cold place, right? And in that process, it's, if you will, creating a wind, which they're using to turn turbines and create energy. So it's causing this torque to happen. So in essence, nuclear power plant is nothing more than a steam generator. But we're also taking that heat, and that's not just the nuclear power plant. That's like factories all over the country do that. They need a heat sink to be able to keep their machines cool. Whatever their machines are doing, they create a lot of energy, create a lot of heat, and therefore need to dissipate that heat out into some other source. Um, and so that's what big factories do, anyways. Is they one of the things they do. And so we've got, not only are we making roads of cement or tar, we're making houses out of cement or tar or glass. We're making metal things that absorb heat. And so along with, I mean, people talk about global warming. They say, well, it's the molecules that we're releasing into the air that are causing all the problems, and it's possible. I'm not a scientist. I haven't gone into that much research. I do know that what they're talking about is a true thing, but I also understand that the Earth is more dynamic than just, if we release a couple of molecules, it's going to create a higher percentage of, and so it's going to reflect more, right? I know that. One of the interesting things recently they've found out is in California, they can change the local temperature by 10 to 20 degrees just by painting roads white. And what that means is, instead of the black that it originally was, it's this black tar or black whatever that just absorbs the heat and doesn't give it off. And so it sits there and it radiates the heat, and it causes hotter days, hotter nights. If they make it at white, the sunlight then comes down and it reflects off, so it causes cooler surface area temperatures of 10 to 20 degrees in the middle of the summer. They've found out in the Mojave, I think it's the Mojave Desert. I'm not entirely sure what it was. I caught it on a Google, image thing or whatever, and they were talking about how they had inadvertently, the top of all these warehouses or all these buildings were white, and the same thing happened. It was 23 degree, and 23 degrees, that's a lot. 23 degree surface area temperature difference. Now, I'm not going to talk about what might be happening in the upper atmosphere, because I know, like I just said, the upper atmosphere is much more convoluted than what's happening on the surface of the Earth. We can understand this a lot better. What's going on up there is kind of, and it's got the same cycle that happens. So the ocean has a cycle. The Gulf Stream, right? That's the one I hear about, is the Gulf Stream. Well, interestingly enough, the Gulf Stream starts off the coast of Greenland, I believe it is, and there's this patch off the coast of Greenland where a lot of ice melts, and apparently the density of salt water is less than the density of is less than the density of fresh water, and so the fresh water sinks because it weighs more, right? And so it sinks into the ocean, and it gets to the bottom, and it starts this cycle that apparently takes somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 years to get all around the Earth. Now, if you think about the atmosphere, it probably has a similar sort of heat sink, heat give, depending on what happens to the Earth based on where it's traveling, how it's spinning, what the wind is. Like, if anybody's seen the Northern Lights, if you've seen the Northern Lights, it looks really cool. It's green and blue, and it's wavy, and it's light, and it's some energy reaction. What it really is, it's a plasma that happens because the solar wind. I don't know much about. I mean, my understanding of the outer space is there's nothing there, but apparently there's a wind that comes by and hits our Earth, and it's actually traveling something like 70,000 miles an hour or some friggin' weird. I don't know. So we've got this wind that comes by, that comes around the sun, and the sun is kind of cruising through outer space, and it's cruising through outer space, 70,000 miles an hour, and so there's this wind that happens that comes by the Earth, and it causes the Northern Lights, right? I'm sure there's a Southern Lights too. I live in northern climate though. What do I know? So the dynamics there are a little more complicated in my world, in my brain, than what's happening right here on the surface of the planet. And I do know that if we can change the surface of the planet, we can change what's going on outside of that. So so this painting the roads white or making the rooftops white or whatever is being proactive instead of reactive to the problems that are going on. Like we've got too many people, we've got too much heat, we've got too much energy going on, and we consume a lot. We consume a lot. The most I found this page once. Apparently, the USDA. I'm sure there's other whatever, but the USDA keeps track of how many animals are slaughtered at slaughterhouses across the United States, which makes sense because why wouldn't we? Right? Somebody needs to know that piece of information. I'm sure the president maybe needs to know how many animals are slaughtered on a weekly basis. So we found this piece of paper. Apparently, it's a document that's online that never moves. It's always in the same spot, and they have monthly, weekly, monthly, whatever, and it comes out to something like we kill nine within the United States. Now, I'm not talking about what they ship in from other countries because they do that too. We're a consumptive society, and it's cheaper to buy food out there and freeze it and bring it in meatballs or in whatever other form we can. Just like anything that we do. But so within the United States, they kill somewhere around 9.6 million cows a year. I think it was 166 million pigs, hogs, whatever under that category. This is, again, only at slaughterhouses probably that kill more than one or two a week, right? Because there are those small slaughterhouses that, I live in northern Vermont. There was this, slaughterhouse in town that probably killed one or two animals a week. I'm sure they didn't keep track of that. But chickens, it's somewhere like 380 million chickens, turkeys, of that sort. Now it doesn't keep track of, moose and deer and whatnot because that number is so small that we don't even talk about that. But that's a lot of animals. So it gets 9.6 million cows. Like, and you think, well, they breed them for that purpose, and they do breed them for that purpose. And so I don't really think about that much because it's kind of one of those things that's so insubstantial that I can change my diet a little bit, but it's that 9.6. It is not going to change that number. Like, we've got far too many people doing what they're going to do, and they're not going to stop doing what they're doing unless there's some monetary reason behind it, right? Like, that's why we do the things we do. It's either because it makes us feel good or because that's what we can do. Right, we need to survive, and if we need to survive, and it's cheaper to buy burger than it is to buy chicken or whatever. That's what we do. The thing about those numbers that get me, and it's not even about those numbers; it's about the numbers that they don't talk about. How many fish do we kill? Right, as the animal gets smaller, it grows kind of exponentially. I would assume that if you averaged the weight out of those animals, it's all roughly the same. Because that's just so much. But how many fish do we kill? How many fish do we kill every year that we don't repopulate into the ocean? Again, that's another ocean-related thing that we don't talk about, we don't deal with, we don't confront those issues because, well, they're bigger than we are, right? And I need to eat, and we need food, so we don't worry about it. Yeah, those are some funny things I found out. Oh, so back to nuclear explosions. Apparently, the number of nuclear explosions that have happened around the world is not just five. It's not just three. It's not Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Indiana or wherever it was, Arizona. It's like 1,500. It's a lot. And there's this video online. I'll probably link it to you when I hook the video, whatever. And at first it's like it zooms over to Arizona, and there's Nevada, and there's this one, and it's just a blurb of light, right? And then it moves over to Japan, and it's got, and then it zooms back to the planet, and all of a sudden, because it's the Cold War, right? So there's the United States and Russia going bang, 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 bang. The United States and Russia are setting off nuclear explosions like crazy, dude. How many times do we have to test this thing? Like, I'm pretty sure it works now. We've done enough of them. Where do we set them off, anyways? Do we do it on an island? Do you do it in the ocean? How does that affect the animals around it? Like, so the speed of sound is 5 times faster in water than it is on land. It's got something to do with the density of the water. Apparently, it's faster still in metal, right? Which is, if you've ever heard of how do you tell if a train is coming, if you don't know any other way that the train is coming, if you put your ear to the train tracks, because the speed of sound is so much faster in metal than it is in the air, you will hear it in the railroad tracks faster than you will on land, and you can tell if there's one coming. And so whatever. But so anyways, there's animals that live in the ocean that work on radar. There's animals that live in the ocean that have ears. Like, I mean, I'm sure a whale must have ears. And sonar, right? Like dolphins have sonar. Right? They've got to be able to hear themselves, because why would they speak if they couldn't hear? They want to know what's going on around them. And so if we let nuclear explosions off in the ocean, what happens to the ocean? So in 50 years, 65 years that nuclear explosions have happened, we've had 1,500 or so. Let's just call it 1,500. Each one of those let off a certain amount of heat, let off a certain amount of sound, let off a certain amount of radiation. And I hear people tell me that we don't affect the world around us. And I'm telling you, man, we do some things that you and I don't do them. But I guess they're done in our honor, right? Like the government does them to protect us, right? Why would it do that if it didn't need to do that? The government obviously feels that it needs to do that to protect us from whoever the big bad guy is out on the other side of the ocean. We live in a weird place, man. We spend something like $1 trillion a year on war in the United States. Apparently, the next 28 countries don't, if you combined them all together, would be what we spend on military. Again, we go back to you are what you eat, right? If you spend all your time focusing on war, that's what you're going to become. You're going to become war. Now, maybe that's not what they're trying to do. They're really trying to protect us from what's going on outside, but you are what you eat, man. If you continue to work out, you're going to continue to look better and feel better and get healthier and be stronger, right? Same sort of difference. So we spend more money than the next 27 countries combined. Most of them are our allies. We build things that we don't need. Like a couple of years back, I remember hearing about the military doesn't need any more tanks, let's say, right? Because we're fighting this war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the problem is you don't need tanks because they're in a city, right? You can't really use a tank to drive around a city to kill people. It's not effective. They probably don't have the roadways that are built for it. They don't have the structure, and there's no real need, right? Tanks are for if you're out in woods, if you're out in the desert, and you need to beat up the guy that's over there, that's in the woods and in the desert, and so we can, from a long distance, we can shoot projectiles at him, which is great. But at some point, you got enough tanks, right? But so the military doesn't want any tanks, but the U.S. government forced them to build and buy the tanks because it's part of our infrastructure, our economies, if you will, right? The states that build those have a certain number of jobs, and so we need to keep the jobs coming and the income from the whatever. And we also sell some of these tanks to other countries, right? Because that's how kind of we fund it at some point. And you say, well, we need jobs. Yeah, we need jobs. We do. But it's I think it's ineffective to continually just fund war, right? Like they say, $1 that the U.S. government spends $1 on war, on military, on the military industrial complex, let's say, and that $1 comes back to the government at $1.56, right? The government actually makes money by spending money, which seems counterintuitive, but when I spend $1 at the gas station then has $1 to pay their employees, that their employee goes out and buys gas at another gas station or buys soda or buys something else, that then spurs that company to do. In each one of these interactions causes taxes, right? The employee gets taxes, but they get paid so that they can go somewhere else and they can buy something else that then gets taxes and then gets paid. So they've done studies and they find that, if the government spends $1 on war, it comes back at $1.56, which is great, right? It comes back more than they put into it, which is really kind of a cool thing. Well, one of the things they found was $1 spent in NASA comes back at like $4.12. Now, I'm not a rocket scientist, but if you've got a return on investment that's 412% versus 156%, why don't you go with the bigger one, right? Now, maybe we can't just convert all of the knowledge base, all of the technology. We can't just spend all the money on NASA. That's dumb, unless we're doing some kind of space race, which we're encouraging that sort of thing. But one of the reasons that happens is because every invention that NASA creates, right? Like, what do you call it? Space foam, right? I don't know, the cushions that you put on your bed. They put it in chairs. They put it in. Basically, it was originally created for astronauts to sit on as they're getting launched up into outer space, because it's a material that is soft and also resilient. So that was created from the government, from NASA. If you've ever seen a marathon, and at the end of the marathon they wrap this aluminum foil looking whatever around the participant, that was also a NASA invention. That's some kind of material that blocks heat transfer. And you would say, well, why would you want to block heat transfer, right? You want those people to cool down. But in reality, you can actually cause hypothermia from a fast enough heat transfer, right? So you got to think the person that's just run the marathon is blasting off a lot of heat. Whether or not it's warm outside, or it doesn't matter. Your body heat is 98.6 degrees, whether you're blasting it or whether you're just existing. It's 98.6 degrees. It's not, your body's not going to give off a temperature of 152 degrees. It just doesn't do that. And so they wrap the body in this aluminum foil, which stops heat from the sun from getting to them, but it also stops the heat going out. It keeps them at 98.6 degrees roughly. And that's healthier. In fact, one of the things, I had a friend that was in the military. He said when they did basic training, they did it in summertime in Texas, and he said at some point, let's say the temperature is 130 degrees. At anything over 130 degrees, they don't train outside anymore. In fact, they don't do anything. They put them in their dress clothes, in their wool, and the full blankets, and they make them go to bed, lay on your rack, and wait till it's over. And you would think, wow, why would you ever do that? Why would you put them in full clothing and then put full blankets on top of them and have them go inside? Well, inside, it's, even if it's 130 degrees, under the blanket, under the clothing, it's still 98 degrees. So it's hot, but it's not 130 degrees. 130 degrees, you can roast your brain, right? Right? Your brain starts to boil at some point. And so they can't keep them cool. And so that's the way they keep cool, is they keep them, your body temperature is the answer. There's a lot of inventions like that have happened because SpaceX is a thing that's going on today. I think part of the X in the SpaceX is how they originally were funded. Part of the original was they did this thing they called it an X Prize, and they based a certain amount of money to give to companies if they could launch. I think it was just launch things into orbit. A certain amount of weight, certain speed, maybe it was twice in a certain day. I don't know, right? Like those are the rules that if a car wants to break a speed barrier that has been existed for, let's say, 712 mile an hour, is as fast as a car has ever gone. What they do is they say, well, if you want to beat that barrier, you have to not only go somewhere, like they do it in the middle of the sand desert in Utah, I believe it is, but they race from one spot to the other at a certain speed, and then they either have to race back, or they bring the car back and they have to race it again. They have to do it twice in a certain period of time to actually beat that time. So it causes some sort of, you not only have to be able to do it once, but you have to be able to do it twice. And I think that's kind of what the X Prize was. At some point it was, you not only have to launch one up in outer space, but you then have to launch another one, or the same one, out in outer space twice within a certain period of time. And so that creates some sort of, you can do this, but not only can you do it, but you can do it over and over again, which I don't know. That was one of the things that the SpaceX did really well, is they actually they reused their gas canister. I think it's a gas canister. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but they reused their rockets, basically, if they will. And whoever has seen the space of days of old, the launches that happen, they've got these two giant tanks on the side of the rocket, right? And then at some point the rocket goes up and these giant tanks fall off, and what happens is those giant tanks land in the ocean. They just fall off and crash into the ocean, and they get destroyed, and so they have to get rebuilt, and so that costs money. Every time you have to rebuild something, it costs money. And so what SpaceX did is, instead of having those things crash into the planet and get destroyed, they bring the thing back down and they land it on a platform somewhere, somehow, and then they can reuse it. And that cut the cost of launching things in outer space almost in half. Not obviously in half, but because there's a lot of cost that's involved with it. But so now they can launch things out of space, and they make a lot of money on doing it, right? The U.S. government pays them something like $212 million. It used to cost them $350 million to launch anything in outer space. Now they pay this company $250 million. The government saves $100 million per launch, and SpaceX makes a lot of money because it only costs them $112 million to launch it in outer space, because they reuse the rocket. It costs them a lot less money. I mean, why not? Yeah, we've come a long ways and things like that. They did a similar sort of thing a long time ago with automated cars, and the first year there was a race out in the Arizona, the desert, or somewhere in the desert, who the heck knows where, and so they did this race, and the race was basically they made up a city, if you will, or a course that's in the desert, and these cars had to run through the track. And the first year, none of the cars made it through. Some of them made it close, but none of them made it through the course. The next year they did it again, except the next year they did it in, let's say, a shanty town, like something that was built a long time ago. Maybe nobody lives there anymore. They got make believe stop signs. They got make believe people walking across the street, and over half of the vehicles that got submitted in for testing passed the course. And so we get a lot better at doing the things that we need to do over time. That's actually one of the interesting things about the world that we live in today. Technology has limited the transfer of information since the dawn of time, since the dawn of humanity, at least. Humanity started out with language, let's say, right? Language was one of the first big technologies that happened that allowed us to communicate with our offspring and transfer said information. Well, at some point, somebody created writing, and now not only can I teach my children, but I can teach generations of children the same piece of information because it's static, right? Basically, whenever I tell you something, you didn't necessarily hear the thing that I said. What you hear is some interpretation based on what's going on in your head and what's coming out of my mouth and what you hear and what you're thinking about. So there's some convolution that happens in every single story that torques it to be something different after a couple of reiterations. And so instead we can write things down, and when we write things down, then we can then propagate that information for a long time. And information used to be what basically kept the rich rich, because they knew how the things worked, and so they could give you enough information to do the thing, but they would never tell you how it worked, because then you would know and then you could do it yourself. And then at some point in time we did this thing we call the Industrial Revolution, and I don't know who's thought about what the Industrial Revolution did to our world. But before it was horse-drawn carriages, right? It was maybe windmills that made grain, or water wheels that made grain, but there wasn't really much of that going on. And then all of a sudden we realized that we could leverage, and what I call this is we learned to leverage our muscle, right? That's kind of what that was. That was learning how to leverage torque and power and energy. Well, computers have come around recently, and they're not learning to leverage our muscles, but they're learning how to leverage our brain. And that's ultimately the most powerful tool that humanity has had. That's what separated us from monkeys, if that's what you believe in. That's what made us different than every other species on this planet, is we learned to not only be competitive, but to care about the beings that lived in our communities, to increase our level of knowledge so that we could make it further and faster and easier and stronger than the generation before us, right? Early on, it was simple things like, well, we call them simple today, but bow and arrow. Bow and arrow was not a thing that existed forever. It was something that was created by a man, by a human being, that thought, oh, well, you could do this. And riding horses, again, was something that was created by some tribe of people, probably lived in the Fertile Crescent in Middle East. And this tribe came in and they had horses, and they pummeled the people that lived there, and they conquered the land. And so to the conqueror goes the spoils, right? And so we continued along that path for a long time. Well, now we've got computers, and computers have exponentially increased the rate of, not only the rate of data transmission from one person to another, which is for a long time controlled how fast some technologies grow, right? Scientists could write a letter to another scientist, but then that took weeks to get there. At some point we shortened it to days or whatever, but the rate of communication has dictated the rate of technology growth for a long time. Well, today we not only have computers, which has made the rate of communication almost instant, but we also have computers that can do things based on the programs that we have designed, so that this person that has an idea can create that idea via a computer almost instantly. And we've made it easy for them to do. We've got programs like AutoCAD and SolidWorks and Photoshop and videos, and this is all created in ease of use and ease of amplification and ease of energy transfer that is going to allow a level of exponential growth that we have never seen in humanity. They talked recently of Elon Musk with SpaceX is now racing NASA to get a Mars colony or a moon colony, right? It'll probably be a moon colony first, and it'll be a Mars colony later. So this private company that's getting paid by our government to launch things out in outer space is the next closest competition to our actual government itself getting becoming a spacefaring nation. That's going to create some weird things if we can't learn some new math and new physics. I mean, if you think about Mars has a third of the gravity of Earth, and the moon is 1/6, and traveling in between from here to there is like zero at the moment. We can actually, again, if we think about a Ferris wheel, right? If you can spin something fast enough, you create this form of artificial gravity along the outside of it. So they found that if they make a wheel that's 2 miles in diameter, they can spin the thing fast enough so that we will experience the same gravity we do on Earth, but it will also cause us not to be sick. Because apparently, if you make it small, you got to spin it really fast, which causes brains to do funny things. But if you make it larger, like 2 miles in diameter, you can spin the wheel slow enough. It's like 6 rotations per day that we don't get sick from motion. And so we can create an artificial gravity for when we have to travel to further distances, which is great. But once we land on the moon or land on Mars for any length of time, it's 2/3 the gravity. It's 1/3 the gravity, whatever it is. If you live there for a couple of years, you may not be able to come back to Earth just because your body won't physically be able to handle it, right? Chances are beings that are born there are going to be taller, right? Because there's less gravity. But their bones are going to have a weaker structure to them. Even if we consider we have the same nutrients, we have the same atmosphere, we have the same whatever, it's still you're going to be taller and your bone structure is going to be weaker because you don't need as much bone structure to allow for said growth as you do on Earth, because you weigh a different amount based on your mass. Your mass is the same, let's say, but you're going to weigh 2/3 as much. So 66%. So instead of 100 pounds, you're going to weigh 66 pounds. Well, your bones don't need to grow quite as strong to compensate for said mass. And they at some point they won't, right? We think of, if you've seen it, WALL-E. I'm exaggerating, obviously, in this case, but the people on the beds, and they continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until they couldn't get out of their beds anymore, right? That's ultimately the kind of thing that could happen. Now, I don't think living on Mars is going to be easy enough to allow for that sort of progression, right? The people that live there are going to have to learn things like, how do I create a magnetic field around the planet such that we can then generate the atmosphere that we need to survive. Right? Essentially, that's one of the things we're going to need to do. They're originally talking about what they're going to do is they're going to go up there and they're going to land and they're going to find a lava tube. That's what it's called when a bunch of hot lava hits the exterior of the planet, but it leaves a tube in the process once that cools, and it pulls all the lava back to the middle, and so there's this giant tube that's maybe, I mean, who knows? It could be 5 feet in diameter. It could be 60 feet in diameter. But it's this tube where lava once traveled from the center of the planet to the exterior of the planet, and it's now left a hollow tube. And so what they're going to do is they're going to go up and they're going to find a place like that. Then they're going to close off the outside, and they're going to pump gases into the inside so that we can have the kind of atmosphere that we need. Even though it doesn't have the same, you don't have the same mass, you're still going to have the nitrogen content, the oxygen content that we need to breathe. Otherwise, we'll die. And then they're going to have to figure out a way to create a magnetic field around the planet so that they can then, because part of the problem with living on a planet like this is it doesn't have, the magnetic field of Earth actually blocks a lot of the sun's radiation. So we don't all die. Right? I don't know if you remember back in the 60s and the 70s, they talked about refrigerant, right? Refrigerant was something that they had been using for too long, and the certain types of refrigerant that they used actually caused holes in the ozone layer. And those holes in the ozone layer were basically places where the atmosphere wasn't what it needed to be to block out the kind of solar radiation that exists. And there was a guy, I was listening to this talk once. He said he was walking across the South Pole, not the South Pole, but around South America, whatever, doesn't matter, the Antarctica. So he's cruising along Antarctica doing the studying that he needs to do based on the penguins or whatever, let's say. And he said his face literally started to melt because, and he went, afterwards went and talked to some people. He said he found out that he happened to be walking underneath a hole in the ozone layer, and it caused his face to melt. Now, I'm sure there's some exaggeration that's going on there. Those are the words that came out of his mouth, not mine. But sounds kind of scary to me to live in a place where there's no atmosphere that protects us from the solar radiation. So we're going to have to create some sort of blockage for the solar radiation so that we can exist on the outside without wearing some sort of outer gear. Now, that's going to be the minimalist of problems, right? There's no soil. So how do you get nutrients into the soil? There's sandstorms that happen all the time, but it's not sand, it's powder, right? If you could think of the difference between sand and flour. I mean, flour is this powder. Sand is a thick sort of like granular sugar. And the difference is when you have sand blowing around, that's one thing. But this powder, this flour, again, blowing around like, there's sandstorms, but they're not sandstorms. So this flower storm that's happening where there's these molecules that are so small that they don't have any granular substance to them, blows around the planet, and it can actually get into the pockets of suits that we currently have, that make it so within a week, the suits that we have would become unusable because you couldn't work the joints anymore, and that would dig in and actually tear holes from the inside to the outside because we don't have the kind of technology to keep that sort of granularness out of our system because we haven't needed to, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. And so until you need to do that sort of thing, we're never going to figure out how to do that thing because why would we? Why would we create a system that we don't need to solve for? So there's going to be some problems living on Mars. We're going to have to figure out how to get water. We're going to have to figure out how to heat the place because wherever we're going to be, apparently it gets down to like minus 147 degrees at night. Like, that's a little too cold for me, man. I don't know about you. So we're gonna have this heat barrier, and we're gonna have to have shielding, and we're gonna have heat generation. We're gonna have to find the water. We're gonna have to somehow bring the molecules, like, to build the atmosphere. Maybe we'll be able to find some of that in the planet itself, right? Mars is probably made of similar molecules to Earth. We're just gonna have to, wipe off the excess flour, again, sand. We're gonna have to get that off, and then we're gonna have to dig whatever we're gonna have to dig so that we can find the molecules that we need. Right? Chances are, most planets are made of somewhat of the same materials. Obviously, gas giants made of something different, but there's got to be somewhere in the middle of that gas giant that has some of the same molecules that we have here on Earth, right? It's just it's a gas. Most of the planet is this gaseous ball of energy based on the density of the center and the heat that is created. So Mars, Jupiter probably doesn't have any water on it, right? It's all been evaporated, but it's got a large enough density in the center that it keeps those molecules somehow in the atmosphere from getting away.